Before we delve into this episode of Career Confessions with Dr. Kerry McAvoy, we would like to kindly inform viewers that there will be some potentially sensitive topics discussed. This could range from abuse, mental health, and trauma. It is important we approach these discussions with empathy and keep in mind many individuals have or are facing similar challenges. We encourage you to prioritize your well-being, and if you find yourself in need of support, we encourage you to seek resources available to you. So, Kerry, firstly, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to talk with us. Your journey, not just as a writer, but as a psychologist, is very inspiring. Your courage in sharing your experiences, being in a toxic relationship through a book, whilst also sharing other personal aspects of your life through your blog and your social media accounts, is commendable. We truly appreciate the insights that you can bring to this conversation.
Kerry, hi. Welcome to the podcast. We've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time because we think the work you're doing is very, very important and really interesting. Today, we're going to cover a lot of ground and, we're really excited to do that. We really think it's a real contribution we're doing and the frameworks we provide can really help a lot of people. So I thought we might start by asking you, what is it that you do and why is it so important to you?
Well, I'm a psychologist first. I had a private practice for over 20 years in the Midwest of the United States, and then was widowed in 2015. And in my grief, rushed into the next relationship and ended up marrying somebody that was very, very toxic. And that was pretty devastating. And I had already closed my practice to care for my late husband who had passed away from cancer. So when I exited that relationship, I was sort of in this quandary. What do I do? What's my next step? I also had an ill son at the time. So I started writing. I'd already been writing for a little while and saw that as a way to be able to bridge the what I experienced with my education and my knowledge. And so then I began to really kind of move in the direction of trauma work and in the sense of education and bringing awareness. So, but my first focus was trying to heal from what happened. So the writing was really actually an expression of my efforts to make sense of what I had just survived.
No, without a doubt, you are the leading expert in toxic relationships. And, you seriously are such an important voice on the topic of abusive relationships. And my question from that is, where did that all begin? Where did that begin the journey of your life?
The understanding of trauma and abuse, or my interest in psychology, or?
Specifically your interest in psychology.
Okay. Yeah, I'd always had a fascination with people and how people worked. I grew up in a kind of a troubled home. It was a difficult home, and so my way of understanding the world. I'm also autistic, so my way of understanding the world is to deconstruct patterns and try to make sense of things. So I had first kind of played around with the idea of being a physician, but then I realized I'd have to deal with blood and kind of things that I didn't really want to deal with. But I realized there's another way to approach the person, and that is to understand the mind and the way that the mind worked. And I learned that at 14. And once I kind of latched onto the idea of psychology, man, I was driven. It was just, for me, it was a straight path through college and as fast as I could get to graduate school. It just felt like perfect, like it called to me. Yeah, I just love psychology.
Yeah, no, I really do see how you approach the person in your book and how you delve into all these characteristics of these different people, like how you draw comparisons between, say, your late husband and then the partner you're with whilst you're talking about in that book. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. I just find the way that we're more alike than we like to think that we are. I mean, each of us want to think that we're sort of very unique, and yes, we are, and yes, we are unexplored territory as well. But there's also this commonality, this universality between all of us as well. And psychology sort of tries to understand both nuances, our personhood, our individuality, but also see the way in which we're alike each other.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I'm a strong believer that to kind of understand, personhood with kind of nuances, you have to kind of go back to one's earliest years, because as child psychology often asserts, that's really when our character is formed and shaped. And so could you take me back to your earliest years, the context that's most relevant to you, your life sort of back in Michigan on a dairy farm?
Right. So for me, the other context that was going on was we were in the Vietnam War for the United States, and my father was facing a draft. So my parents married, and they immediately sought to have a child so that they could avoid the draft. So I was born 1 year into the marriage. And then they also rapidly had my sisters 1 year later and another one 2.5 years later. So there was 3 of us all under 4. So that was what I grew up with, is sort of like this very close relationship with my sisters. And my parents were young. I mean, they were in the early 20s and we're in the middle of all this kind of turmoil. I mean, the United States is going through a lot of gender inequality kind of issues, racial tension issues. And that was sort of the backdrop of what was happening in my life. I mean, nighttime seeing images of the war being played on the news, while we ate dinner and those types of things. But in the middle of all of this, my home life was also just filled with lots of struggles, parents struggling with each other, being young parents with difficult families. And then there was also abuse that I was struggling with. And I talk about this in the book, is that there was sexual abuse that was early on that happened to my sisters and I with a family member. And, so that here's all this kind of trauma and drama and grief and feeling very unprotected, unsafe. And no one knew that I was autistic. So we have that happening too, so that, how was I managing relationships in the middle of all this? So it was just really my way of making through it was to spend a lot of time on my own. I sort of did a lot of mental activities, like I'd create puzzles and poetry and those types of things. I would take long walks on my own. I did a lot of things kind of with my interior world, tried to make sense of what was happening with all this chaos that was happening.
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry to hear we went through that. But nonetheless, I really do thank you for your openness, because I think in order to really understand someone, you do have to kind of go back to their earliest years. I mean, I think we're really all kind of molded by our earliest context, whether it be our deep characteristics or our deep passions. I mean, I think all of that really is nurtured in our earliest years. So, I mean, if I was in the walls of your home at that time, what would I have felt or seen or experienced in relation to the sort of relationship between your parents? Was there affection? Was there open love? That sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. They are extremely affectionate with each other. That's the interesting thing, is I think they ran, when it was hot, it actually was cold. But that was few and far between, actually. What was more likely to happen was they were actually quite loving and warm to each other, but they were sort of busy in their lives and busy with trying to manage very complex family dynamics. My grandmother and great grandmother lived a quarter mile away, so they were very intrinsically a part of our family dynamic. So that was what they were embroiled with, and I just felt like, as children, we were sort of the add-on. Our job was to sort of be seen and not heard. We actually heard that. I mean, that's sort of a common saying, at least in rural mid-Michigan, among families to their children, was, they expected us to sort of participate, be involved. We also were seen as part of the farm. We early were taught to do chores. I remember as a 5-year-old up on a stool helping my mom wash dishes. So, we were just sort of like a part of that fabric of that. So it was a close-knit family in a lot of ways, but I didn't feel like there was the way that we raise children today is vastly different than the way that they raised children then. And we were just sort of, go do your thing, stay out of the hair of the parents. The parents have adult things to do. Just don't be under the way. That was sort of the feeling that I had as a child.
No, that must have been really hard on you. As I was reading your book, I did kind of feel that disconnection, between you and your parents, and between your parents, just because of how you talk about how you're just like you said, just part of a farm rather than just being a kid a lot of the time, which is really unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they would do things. I mean, it was interesting because they also did a lot of education. Now, I wasn't homeschooled, but there was a lot of homeschooling experience going on. My parents were involved in 4-H and stuff. So much so that when I went to college, and we didn't have AP in high school at that point, advanced placement, so you could actually prepare to study for college. But we were offered at the college orientation, the college level entrance or exam. I don't know what it's CLEP is what the initials stand for. I'd never heard of it, didn't know it existed, but they offered us to sit and take it. And I thought, well, why not? But I had gotten so much education at home, in addition to a really good, solid high school education, that I passed all the examinations. So I basically passed out of my freshman year just at orientation. So kind of imagine this home where there is this emotional shallowness. There's, this sort of stress and tension, and yet there's richness at an educational level because they really wanted us to do better. My father, this is the other thing I don't really say in the book, but my father was illiterate. He could do basic math, and he could probably work out maybe reading very easy text, but to write and to manage a sophisticated, like to sit down to read a book, that didn't happen. He wasn't able to do that. So he wanted me to do better. He wanted his kids to have much more than he had, which he was sort of limited at a trade level. And so it was very important. It was said right out from the start, you're going to go to college. This is what we expect from you. And they did a lot of groundwork to make that happen. So it was a kind of an odd home, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It was just, really rich in some ways, and then there was this poverty in other ways, this lack in other ways.
Yeah, no, like me and Craig have talked about that before, just that emotional absence, like with your parents, but then also having them care so much about your education and your future is quite a hard thing to reconcile those two different ways of love, just show love in a different way, I guess.
Yeah, it's almost like there's at least for me, there's a more expanded conception of what love might look like to me growing up compared to that of my parents. And a lot of my friends, can relate to that kind of thing as well. It's really interesting to point out, though, that growing up, parentage was very much quite isolating in some ways. But then, lots of culture theorists I've read into have said that parenthood has kind of been underpinned by child-centeredness, and it's kind of evolved over time, basically. So that's quite an interesting sort of connection there, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do see that there is an excessive child-centeredness that I would certainly say United States or American parents are doing with their children. I certainly did with my children, and yet there wasn't that. That wasn't how things were in the 60s. And yet, my parents, I would say, probably were more involved, certainly at an educational level, than a lot of other parents were for their parents of that age,
Yeah, when you look back on your parents' relationship, how in hindsight did that shape your perception of, say, love? Is there anything you look back and sort of think, that's why I became this particular way as a romantic partner? Or, that's why I navigated certain relationships in certain ways?
Yeah, my parents were very loving. They loved each other all the way to the end. It was a difficult relationship, though. I would say they had an incredible physical connection where you just knew they adored each other and depended on each other. But they didn't really know how to share emotionally, intimately. I don't think that they talked about secrets or the things that scared them. I don't think they really went there with each other much. I don't even think they have the language for it with each other. So I got to see this close relationship, which was a very affectionate, but I didn't see these big, rich conversations. And then the other big piece that was happening is that men were very much centered in the life of the home. So my father was waited on and sort of taken care of. And, he worked hard. Now, granted, he worked 12, 16-hour days most days of the week. So I knew he was exhausted and really stressed and hardworking person. But I didn't really see, there wasn't sort of that was expected, that's what women did. And so that carried through too into my first marriage with my late husband. It's that, he also worked very hard, but he had more of a job that stayed 8 to 10 hours a day, maybe 8 to 11 hours a day. But on the other hand, it was expected that I would carry the whole home. I think that then set me up to then, sort of when I met this most recent relationship, to think that to really respect his masculinity, to really want to make sure that he felt important and respected, and I didn't realize that made me at risk for being abused. And here's another piece that I've really been thinking a lot about is my identity, and I think this is true for a lot of, at least for my parents and my grandparents, identity as a woman came through the identity of the relationship. It was very hard for me to think of myself separate from a relationship. So for me to I know people say to each other, you should just leave. And things start to get bad, just walk up, you should just step out and leave. But for me, that was part of who I was, leave myself. If I left the relationship, I was leaving myself, not just leaving the relationship, because myself was a part of that relationship. its healthiness reflected on me. So it's really kind of hard to separate that all out. And I saw the same thing from my grandparents and my parents as well. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. You know, you see two separate people. I didn't feel like I was a complete separate individual outside of that relationship. But that's something that's happened now, but it hadn't happened until just recently.
Yeah, no, following on from that, I'm really interested to kind of dive into the relationship you had with the abusive individual you named Caesar in your book. That's of course what centers your book. So do you mind sharing a little bit about your time with Caesar?
Yeah, I met him, like I said, I started dating way too fast. My whole is that if you think about me being centered around a relationship, my identity in a relationship, and then I just suddenly abruptly in 5.5 months lose everything that has defined me. I mean, I met Brad when I was 19, and then I'm losing him at 52. So my entire adult life had been spent with Brad. And now all of a sudden I'm me in a community. I was living in a community that was extremely family based. So all my relationships were based around us as a couple. So I just felt like untethered, like I was lost. And just like when you have a child, your relationship with your community changes. When you're widowed, your relationship with the community changes again. Nobody tells you that. But now I was like displaced. I didn't really have a place in these relationships. I was the tag along or the add-on or the uncomfortable image of what can happen to somebody, that you could be in a relationship and you can lose it, and people would look at me and I'd feel like I was sort of the representation of that, the stigma of it. So I wanted out of that. I desperately wanted out. So I started dating really, really fast, and I met this guy and he just seemed fabulous. And it's interesting because here I'm a psychologist and I know a lot of, in fact, my graduate training was one of the unusual ones that focused a lot on personality disorders. I had classes on personality disorders, but we don't talk about in psychology what happens inside of a relationship with a personality disorder. We just talk about the development, the etiology, the dynamics of the persons, the manifestation of the characteristics of the personality, but we don't talk about what happens to those around them and what their relationship style is like. I've never heard of that discussed. So I didn't know what love bombing. I mean, I heard of the word love bombing, but I really didn't know what it meant. Yeah, I heard people talk about thinking they met their soulmate, kind of thought it was silly until I met this person, and suddenly I've had this experience, this magnetic experience of feeling like I'd met my match. Like this was better than anything I've ever had in my life. That's what it felt like when we first met. Now, there are warning signs, and granted, I put them in the book. So you as a reader are like, oh, well, that's not good. Oh, that's not good. But when you're in the throes of it and you feel all this great moments, this fabulous moments of feeling really connected, you overlook the bad moments thinking, well, no relationship's perfect. Look, I was married 31 years to somebody. We didn't start out great, but it got better as we aged. This will happen too. We'll get there too.
No, that actually coincides with, I think in your prologue on page 10, I think you discussed a tactic that a lot of narcissists tend to use, sort of mimicking the likes and dislikes of their partner to kind of sort of make, like you say, sort of overlook, what is genuine abuse. Could you provide a more concrete example of what that might look like?
Like initially or down the road?
We could start initially.
Yeah, initially what they'll do is they'll mimic, it's called mimic parenting and mirroring you. And so mirroring means they'll actually mirror your body language. So if you're cross-legged and it's your right leg over your left, they'll cross-leg as well and put their right leg over the left, and or do the literal opposite of the mirror. So you're looking at a reflection of yourself. By the way, psychologists learn to do this with clients, and we're told to do this because it develops fast rapport. So this is a technique that's actually been researched to show that if you want to help someone build trust with you to get somewhere pretty fast, this is a really great way to do it, is to mirror their behavior. It's very simple to do it. We often do it without being conscious of it. You may mirror each other and not realize that you're doing it. But so he was mirroring me. And then parroting is to kind of repeat back what people say and sort of use the same language. And then the mimicry is that's the same thing, is that what they do is they create, they find the ways that you guys have a similar past, and then they they kind of highlight that, like the fact that we had similar age children, similar types of careers, you know, so they find those types of similarities, but they also then start to kind of create this future with you. You know, would you like to do this in the future? Would that be something you'd find fun? So they kind of get you to dream about what you're going to do. But while they're doing that, they'll say things in the moment where, like, I've never met anyone like you before. This is incredible. I've never felt this connection before. So what's happening is they're in your mind, they're creating a past, a special moment with you in the present, and then a potential future. So that creates a sense of connection with this person that actually doesn't really exist, because the past is actually, they're just picking up on your cues of, you know, they hear you went here, or you lived there, or you did this, and then suddenly they'll say, oh, they did too. Now, maybe they really never did, or maybe they did, you know, like maybe they drove through the city. Maybe they've never, you know, stopped and actually know Chicago, but they'll suddenly, oh, I know Chicago. I've seen this and this place in Chicago or whatever. So yeah, it's really a powerful experience, because most of the time when we meet people, we're aware of the differences between us, you know, that your hobbies are really different than mine, or maybe you're really into, you have this perspective of politics that I don't share, but what they're doing is they're copying you. So you feel this symmetry with this person. And we all unconsciously have this intense desire to meet our twin. We don't really actually think about that, but that's what we're looking for. And so you feel that you've met this person, and it's incredible. But what I missed was, and it happened right away, you know, he was also offloading emotional responsibility really quick. I'm trying to think of an example of how that happened. One was I share in the book how he insisted on carrying everything and then saying, it's time somebody else takes care of you. But what he was establishing is a dominance. Things are going to go my way. I'm in control here. And will you comply? That was also a test. Are you going to go along with me exerting my dominance, or are you going to like resist? And so you'll experience that kind of testing of you initially too. And that kind of puts you in a spot, because we don't want to be antagonistic, you know, especially on a first date. You really want your best foot forward. So for you to say, no, that's, you know, push it, then suddenly you're like, why am I making this so difficult? But yet, by failing that test, in other words, my over-compliance said that I was going to go along, that I was going to be pretty easy, which I unfortunately continued to give that message that I would go along.
Well, okay, so that's really like insightful. So going back to what you said about the whole like mirroring body language, I think that is so like honestly quite scary, because it's something that you wouldn't even notice, and then in hindsight you look back to it and you just really think like it can take on so much meaning like, as time goes on. And I was like, when I was reading a book, all these like little things are just building and building and building. And in isolation, it might not seem like such a big deal, but like as it like builds and like gathers together, it just becomes, it's so isolating, and just like you're so dependent on you, you're just really trapped.
Exactly. There is this building that's happening, and there's other cult-like training, or I'm sorry, cult-like programming that's occurring in that first meeting, in the first few meetings, that you're not even aware of either. There's excessive eye gazing. That's another tactic that cult leaders use to build rapport with their new accolades, or their new people they're trying to bring into the cult. There's also, they'll also touch your arm. They'll reach out and touch you. That's another technique. Therapists use that as well. People who are trying to sell you something will do that to you. So there's like these known tactics that we know that are very powerful in building a connection, lowering someone's resistance, lowering their guard, building actually false trust. It's not earned. It's happening too fast. You shouldn't trust this person yet. You have this incredible sense of rapport and connection that isn't really deserved, and you're becoming increasingly suggestible as a result of it. It's also, in fact, I heard Sandra Brown, who's a big researcher in this area, she did this massive study out of 2014 at Purdue University of 600 couples. She calls it a hypnotic state. They're moving you into a hypnotic state.
Yeah, no, you captured that transition really well in your book. Like there's just a slow like building of like tension and all these different like issues. So I wanted to ask, was there a grieving process about the person that you thought Caesar was, if that makes sense, whether that was during a relationship or after it ended? So that person that you imagined yourself to love, so the person that he depicted himself to be.
Yeah, you're asking, did I grieve losing that person?
Yeah, the person that like he presented himself to be.
Yeah, and there's another key piece in there, and I don't really talk about it in the book because I didn't understand it when I was writing the book. I understand it now, but it was a concept that I didn't have when I was. That's the other thing. I've learned so much more. So if I was to go back, I probably would be putting some of this in better. But there's what's called cognitive dissonance happening. So you develop this image of the good person that you think you met, the delightful, wonderful, magnetic person, but you're also at the same time meeting the real person. They're in themselves. They don't actually morph into the different person. They're both people at the same time, who you want them to be, but who they actually are. You're experiencing that as well. You're experiencing who they really are. And I hint to that one moment in that first date when I asked him my non-negotiable question, and he did this, his face like shifted. He got really, I could see he was angry that I asked it, and he said no. And there was the moment of his real self inserted in kind of like popped out in the middle of this love bombing that was happening. And then of course he shifted back into the person he had become for me. So yeah, so what that also keeps you track in the relationship, because you can't determine which is real. Is it the person I met, or is it the person that I see a lot of and that I'm living with and I'm increasingly seeing more and more of? But it is interesting. You're asking a powerful question. I don't struggle with that as a lot of people that I meet. You know, I work with a lot of women and men who are out of these relationships. I have a membership, so they talk a lot about this dynamic inside the membership. I know that wasn't real, and it's helped me to be able to sort of separate that out. Is that person actually never existed? Do I wish he existed? Yeah, that would be wonderful. But he actually wasn't. I mean, the love bombing has probably actually stopped just before we got married. If I could go back in time and pinpoint it, I would say it was as we were leading up to the wedding that it really actually quit. You know, that the relationship was actually over, and he was moving into seeing me in a devalued way and a less ideal way. So I actually lived with the good part of him extremely short period of time. So for me, I think the grieving is less painful. Whereas I know people who've been with somebody for years and years, and they have a lot of good moments, and I still feel them grieving that person. You know, they'll give you this really wonderful moment, and then they'll tell you in that same period of time this really horrible story of what happened, and you're thinking, wait, you just said they're the best thing ever, and then you described this horrific act of violence. How does that work? But I don't feel that same kind of struggle, because I think what really helped me, this is unfortunately, and fortunately, was that losing Brad and really grieving that. I mean, to the point that I was almost undone. I think actually broken heart is actually a real thing. It's where your heart swells from the pain of grief. My chest hurt. It ached. I mean, literally physically ached losing Brad. And I didn't feel that over Caesar. I didn't have that kind of loss, but I lost the dream of it. I think that was the harder part, was the hope that it was something, but it really wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. Like this new person comes into your life right after you suffered such an immense loss. It really must signify like that sense of hope. And I can imagine, for like other people who experienced it, like that sense of mourning more, just must be so heartbreaking because that person just doesn't exist. It's not like we left you, but just they were never best to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's the other big difference, is that I had a big relationship that it was normal, a big, long, normal relationship. And I have that to base this off of and compare. And yes, I deeply miss Brad and deeply have grieved him a lot and continue to grieve him, which this just feels very different for me. And that has helped me, honestly, because I think what I really struggle with, to be really frank about all of this, is the loss of the hope. And that loss of hope came with the loss of Brad. So, there's a part of me, do I really want to spend the rest of my life single? No, not really. Do I think that I will actually get in another relationship? I don't know, probably not. Not very hopeful about that. That to me, there's where the grief is. I still work on that. But losing Caesar, it was so not really, because I know he wasn't really authentically real. He wasn't authentically, I didn't meet the real person, and I wouldn't have chosen the real person.
Yeah, now as a naive outsider, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I don't know his issues deeply enough to kind of know the full complexity. But one thing which I think is quite obvious is that leaving an abusive relationship is really complex. In your book, you mentioned that women, on average, attempt to leave their relationships, abusive ones, that is, about 7 times, I think. In your book, I think you say that. Could you explain why you personally found it so difficult to leave Caesar? I know you shared a business with him, so that might have added a whole new layer of complications.
It's back to this idea of cognitive dissonance. So what cognitive dissonance, like I explained, was this duality. You're meeting a person who's not really who they say they are. You don't know that. You're also splitting inside. There's a dual you that's being created too. There's the you that knows how to deal with the difficult person, the real person that's learning how to like be careful, not activate that, try to like keep the antagonism as low as possible. And then there's also the you that really loves the person you thought that you met that's actually the false persona. So you're getting bad memories creating, you're having good memories created, you're learning how to deal with them on when they're this way, how to deal with them that way. But here's the thing that makes it so tough is that you thought you made a solid decision based on real information, and it wasn't. It was based on false information, but you don't know that. But now your trust in your decision-making ability has been corrupted. Now you don't trust yourself. And on top of it, they're gaslighting you and deceiving you and doing all sorts of mind games that are really confusing you. So now you're not even for sure what's real because you're being told that you don't remember it right, or that's not how it happened, or you're being too sensitive about everything, or there you go again, or whatever it is. So your sense of your being in touch with yourself is really being eroded. And the terrible thing about cognitive dissonance, and it's a natural thing that happens anytime we face kind of ethical decision, but now you're in this it's momentary. You know, your decision of, do I have a donut for lunch or am I going to have the sandwich? Okay, you have a momentary pang, you make a decision, maybe not even a good decision, you get past it, you go on, it resolves. But when you're in these relationships, it never gets resolved. So you stay in this pang, that pain, which I don't even know how to describe it to you. It's agony. I have never been in more mental torment than I was when I was in that relationship, because you keep wrestling. What's real? What's not real? Is he working on this relationship? Is he not working on the relationship? Is he cheating? Is he not cheating? Is there any hope here? Is there no hope? And you just sort of like turn it over and literally over and over and over thousands of times a day in your mind trying to make a decision. And as that happens, it is damaging neurology. There actually is called cognitive losses that are being experienced because of the high level of stress, which then compromises your decision-making ability. So now the very thing that you can't do, you're getting worse at doing, because now the hippocampus is shrinking, the amygdala is swelling, you're having all sorts of this, you're not sleeping well, you're on edge, you're struggling with food, you're struggling with your weight, you're struggling with your body, you're struggling with forgetfulness. I mean, it kind of compounds the situation. So it's extremely difficult to make a decision in that. So that's one reason why it's really hard. But the other reason is because, like I said, the loss in trust in yourself. You thought you made a great decision. You were a high-functioning person before you met them. You made a terrible decision. You got into this relationship. So what's the right decision to do about it? You were wrong before. Are you wrong now? You don't know. So that makes it really hard. And on top of it, this is the other really horrible part we don't talk about much either, is that personality disorders don't have a lot of internal scaffolding. They don't have ego strengths to resist impulses or to deal with tough emotions or to handle their internal sense of shame and deal with failure. What they're doing is they're externalizing those needs instead of dealing with it inside, figuring out how to resolve it, comfort, self-soothe, all that stuff. They're relying on those around them to do it. That's the offloading that's happening. So whenever they're upset, you're expected to suddenly become perfect to sort of stabilize their world or to comfort them or show up or something. So whenever they sense that you might leave and they're not ready for that, and they don't have the new person, the new way they're going to stabilize themselves set up, then they pull you back with the love bombing and the promises and the future faking and all that stuff. It's going to get better. I've never worked harder. You know, I need you. I've never loved anyone like you before. And you think, oh, this feels like the beginning. Maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe they really are working on it. So all of that creates so much confusion. It makes it extremely difficult to leave. And then there's one last piece, and that is They know very well what's most important to you, because I think when it comes to studying human behavior, they excel at it. They're better than most of us at it. And they know what you don't want to lose. And they have no compunction to take those things from you and make sure they hurt you. So you also know, if I do leave, I'm going to suffer in all these ways. They're going to make sure that it happens, because I've already seen how they do it to me in other ways and how they do it to other people. I know these things are going to actually happen. And that's terrifying. So you'd rather stay with what you know than the fear of what you don't know.
Yeah, no, like whilst reading it, just all these different like factors and reasons as to why you couldn't leave, and just all of them combined together. Just the fact we were able to leave is just really courageous.
Thank you. I feel like, interestingly enough, I feel like I was a coward. I felt like my leaving was the path of least resistance. I didn't know. I now know. I mean, this is not in the book, but I now know that Caesar is really dangerous. I recently learned that I share in the book how we're doing this condominium development process, this construction. Well, the developer and us were in a financial fight. And so there wasn't good feelings between our side and them. And yet the developer was super kind to me, and he would come up to me and ask me how I was doing and am I okay? And I didn't know why. Why is he being so nice? Because we're legally, financially fighting him over something. Well, I just found out recently was whenever Caesar would storm off and stonewall me and disappear, he would go into the elevator and violently attack the elevator in the interior. They thought he was going to destroy the elevator. And they thought, because it was being captured on camera, and they thought, if he's doing this to our property, what's he doing to her? And that's why they were checking in with me, is because they were really alarmed for my safety. So I sensed that. I sensed, Caesar never laid a hand on me, although he a couple times got close and threatened me. Yes, I saw him do, throw things and break things, but the part of me sensed that if I really took him on, I would lose. That he wouldn't hold back from hurting me. And I had known he'd been violent with his past wives. So yeah, so when I left, I was really praying for an out. I needed something that was going to make it easy for me to slide out. And so when my son became ill and we had to move, internationally move, I thought, there it is. I mean, how can he argue against that? Family needs me. And this is really culturally acceptable for me to be there for the family. And I also knew it would bore him. I mean, who wants to sort of stay by the side of somebody who's sick? I've already done this once with my late husband. I knew what battling cancer was going to look like for my son. So I just kind of had a sense of, there's the door. I just need to move through it, and this will sort of take care of itself. And it did.
You mentioned the past partners of Caesar. I think you specifically do it in the final chapters of your book, or at least you mentioned you taking this step to kind of reach out to those exes of his.
I did.
Could you sort of, detail your experience of contacting them? Because, they would have obviously suffered this, a similar kind of violent abuse at the same hands of the same person, really. So how did it feel to kind of connect with them? And what impact did it have in your own healing journey?
Yeah, that was really powerful. I had a strong pull to want to contact them before we got married. I even had done enough to research them, knew who at least one or two of them were, but I didn't, because I don't know, we're just not encouraged to do that. And I wasn't for sure how honest they would be with me. So I didn't before I got married. But when this was all done, I reached out he'd been married 4 other times, and I reached out to 3 of the 4. One of them I didn't, because I know him and her are still in a relationship with each other. And I just felt like, I wouldn't get an honest report. And secondly, then he would learn that I was doing this, and I just didn't want him to know. So I talked to 3 out of the 4, and it was fascinating because the first wife, they were married about 2 years, and she lives in another country still. And they parted ways when he moved to the United States. And her story was fascinating because parts of it lined up with what he told me, and then parts of it was vastly different. But I heard the same behaviors I experienced she was reporting in that brief relationship. And then the second one was the most interesting. They had been married 17 years. So I knew she had the longest history with him. so when I reached out to her and was able to speak to her, it was just one time. She only would speak to me once. She really actually wanted to interview me more than she would allow me to interview her. But it was interesting. Her questions were fascinating to me. They said as much as if she just told me. She asked me if he'd hit me. And then when I said no, he hadn't, then she said, "You're really lucky." So I learned that I figured it was abusive, but I learned that there was domestic violence in the home with her in that relationship. And I also, it was just really fascinating. But the most information I got was from the third wife. And I knew the least about her. He would hardly talk to me about her because, hey, I'm a psychologist. So I always was prying him for information all the time. Always trying to take the history from him all the time. But he would hardly talk about her at all. And she was the one that actually she'd written a book herself about her whole life, kind of like, and there was a chapter devoted to him. But what I heard is that the same patterns that I experienced with business trips that were affairs, cheating early on, deception right away, all of that is, again, the same pattern was showing up, and each woman would tell me the same story. I'd hear the same story. So I known he'd been doing this from the very beginning, since he was a very young man. But that was but the shocking part for me was when she said to me, I think he'd been poisoning me. She just spontaneously tells me that. And I'm thinking, what? And I had that suspicion that I had been being poisoned as well. And so it was just it was one of those moments you're just shocked. I just lost words. And then she said, yeah, I was really sick. I think he was poisoning me. So.
Yeah, I think in your case, it's really interesting because you reaching out to these women is different to what general consensus says, because you learn more about abuse you underwent. For example, the whole you might have been poisoned. That must have been such scary piece of knowledge to have received, especially after the whole ordeal.
Yeah, what disturbs me though, and this is because when I don't know how well I conveyed in the book how sick I was and how increasingly sick I was getting. We would have really bizarre moments of me having unusual symptoms that normally would have been alarm. You would have been racing to the ER if I had done that. But we acted like they were nothing, nonchalant. And there's where I attribute back to the home life that I had grown up in, where also there was bizarre things happening there at times. And there was this nonchalant sort of, well, we just don't see that because we don't really have a framework to deal with it, because that would be confrontational, because we'd have to call out that's bad behavior, like not getting help for the sexual abuse, my family not reporting it and not seeking care for the kids, for us as kids. We didn't do that. We sort of normalized this really bizarre behavior happening in the family. And then when it was happening with Caesar, again, this bizarre behavior would happen, and we normalized that as well. And I think that's, now looking back, was really disturbing to me, because if my kid did that or someone I loved did that, I'm like, whoa, we're going to go get help. This is people just don't do that,
Yeah, no, yeah. You mentioned sexual abuse. I'm not sure if that's a good segue to the sort of sex addiction that I think Caesar suffered during your time together. Something that's really taboo. I guess the first part of my question is, how did you kind of first come to learn your partner suffered from sex addiction? And what was it like being in a relationship with a sex addict?
I know.
Yeah.
I actually wrote at medium.com. My most popular blog article was what it's like to be married to a what it's like to be married to a sex addict. I wrote it was an open letter to myself, like what I wish I'd known then that I now know. But I didn't know. I asked him in our first date, are you into pornography? That was one of my non-negotiables because of an early childhood traumatic event that I experienced. And it just wasn't a part of my first marriage. My first husband he just didn't believe in it. It wasn't so I just felt like, and as a person who's grown up extremely religious, it just felt very taboo for me. I wasn't aware of it, that he had a sex addiction until our honeymoon, and that was a delayed honeymoon. So we'd been married 2 months. I had no clue. Now there was little tip-offs. Now that I look back, Yeah, sometimes the photos he'd send me was a little risque, and I'd think, why was he looking for a photo like that to send me as a good morning text? That's kind of odd. But I never allowed myself to put 2 + 2 together to kind of come up with, that means he's searching photos. I just never kind of went there. I was really naive about all of that. But so what happened is that on our honeymoon, instead of having sex, which you think we should be doing on our honeymoon night, I wake up and find him watching pornography. And then he just continued to sort of be disinterested in being intimate with me. That was my experience, was just a disinterest in me, that the interest that was there initially quickly was gone. And then there was this disinterest in me. And what was happening was all this excessive energy was moving outwards to other relationships with other people. But I wasn't aware of the cheating until that same honeymoon period, when at the final night of the honeymoon, when another woman contacted me who was mad at him because he disappeared because he was on a honeymoon with me and wasn't answering her texts. She decided to sort of get back at him and contact me to let me know that he'd been cheating with her. So that's how I found out about it. But then once that started to happen, it was like the discovery that this is big was a trickle experience. It wasn't like, okay, now that you know, let me come out and tell you everything about I've been doing. No, I didn't know that. I continue to make these discoveries, one thing after another. I think I'd know everything. Oh no, that's not what happens. In fact, we went right away to a sex addict treatment program for a 3-day intensive. And they told me there, all you know is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that you don't know. And then we'd gone and saw a specialist for sex addiction in our local town, and she'd given him an assessment, and the assessment came back that he had a severe addiction. But she never described to me, which is interesting. My experience of all the treatments was the focus on him, not also on him and the partner. So nobody ever said to me, let me describe to you what that means. Let me tell you what that probably also indicates that he's into. Let me tell you what the likelihood of recovery from this is. But by the way, the recovery from sex addiction, if you think that it's a real thing, and I do think that it's a real thing, it's roughly the same as error. The percentage of recovery is the same as the margin of error. Yeah. So is there a recovery from it? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe there isn't. But nobody ever said that to me. So I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I'm kind of like uncovering this. It wasn't even until midway into the marriage, 1 year in, that I find out that it's so extensive that he's seeing prostitutes. I had no idea about that. And by the way, there was no effort to protect me. So I had been, literally exposed, vulnerable, very vulnerable. So it was devastating. But emotionally for me, the hard part was feeling like, you can't measure up, that what's wrong with me? Am I not lovely enough or beautiful enough? Yeah. The missing intimacy, because not only is it not intimate sexually, but there's this missing intimacy. I'm not his go-to person. I'm not hearing his private thoughts about stuff. I feel like I have to keep trying to chase him for all of that. He's not really pursuing me and letting me know that he loves me. There's not this nurturing or, that's going, certainly not what I saw with my parents, certainly not what I experienced with Brad. Instead, it's being siphoned out and siphoned off to everybody else. Actually, I think nobody's getting it. To me, sex addiction is a couple things. One is it's a coping mechanism people are using as a way to distract from pain. Don't have better ways learning how to manage difficult issues, so they manage by just being caught up with trying to pursue someone new. But it also is predatory behavior, and I definitely saw this with Caesar, is that a lot of what he enjoyed was the gratification of the degradation of another person. So he's also about that. So he referred to himself as hunting, and that he saw himself as a wolf, and he called women around him meat. So there's this very predatory, sort of aggressive quality to it that's very uncomfortable, very sickening.
Yeah.
So you mentioned how you underwent a treatment plan with him. Can you explore, delve more into what that was like and what that involved?
Yeah. So the big problem with sex addiction is that it is now in the ICD-11, I think, if I'm doing those initial, I may have mixed those. I think I have the initials correct. So the World Health Organization does recognize it, but United States does not. It's not in the DSM-5. So so maybe some sexual obsessive behavior acting out might be, but not really. So as a result, there is not funding, there is not the research, and then there is not the provision of insurance payments for treatment of it. Okay, so that means everything that you do here in the United States has to be pursued independently and privately. You have to pay out of pocket for it. So it makes it extremely, extremely expensive. So I started to research, but there is certification. You can find therapists who are certified sex addiction treatment specialists. And so that's what I did. I began to search for who I could find in the United States and where we could get some help. So we went to an intensive outpatient program, which is really, basically, I should have realized that it's just an assessment. I mean, I was hoping there would be like some kind of treatment, but treatment actually is going to happen on a long period of time over a long-standing relationship. So initially what they did was they met us for this, and it's like an all-day thing. So you go and you start at 9 and you don't leave until 6 or 7, and it's for the couple. But really, the couple, the focus is the person who's struggling, the person with the addiction, and it's about assessing and then setting up a treatment program, and then that's really basically it. But what I think is wrong with that system is that the failure to recognize that there is betrayal trauma happening to the partner. So there really isn't enough focus on it. I know that there are programs now. Omar Menwala is probably a big name in the United States who's doing a lot of work looking at the partner's experience of that. But for me, I felt really overlooked. I felt invisible. As much as he was making me feel invisible with his pursuit of other relationships, I felt like the treatment aspect of it also failed me. And its failure to see me as also a co-patient. That wasn't just one patient. There's 2 patients. But we continued. I mean, the whole length of our marriage was we were in treatment, one form or another. We were in treatment. But I just felt like a lot of it missed what was happening for me. And that was really painful because I felt more like I was back on my own. You know, interestingly, you made that connection of how did I start my childhood? And I said, well, I spent a lot of time alone. I did things on my own. I tried to figure out how to navigate the complexity of very challenging things on my own as a young kid. I felt like I was doing the same here. You know, I was on my own a lot, trying to navigate it, trying to cope with my own interior struggles, my own pain alone, and not a lot of support and help or recognition that I was in trouble as well.
Yeah, no, it's really it was quite like upsetting to see, like, even though this was like a partnership, we were really cast aside and isolated, even though these issues affected both of you. So going on from that, I wanted to just ask about, so you are a psychologist, like you mentioned before, so you have a deep understanding of like abusive traits and the average person. So imagine that once you discovered that you're in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic and abusive, that must have been an incredibly intense experience. So I was wondering if you'd like share what it was like to realize this, considering your professional background. So how did it feel to come to terms with the fact that you were involved with someone who displayed such destructive behavior?
Yeah, I recognized he was narcissistic pretty early on, but like I said, I didn't really understand what it was going to do, the kind of relational harm that it was going to present to me. And then when we were in the relationship, it felt like to me we were going from one crisis to the next, one big discovery of abuse and betrayal, which really, to me, the abuse was mostly around betrayal, a lot of betrayal. So that would go from one discovery betrayal to the next discovery betrayal to the next discovery betrayal. So it was about survival. To me, it was just like trying to keep my head up and surviving. And then as we got further into the relationship, and I was really like, why am I staying? No one would object to me leaving. I mean, I certainly would get a lot of societal permission and approval for my decision, but I couldn't leave. So what was wrong with me for not being able to leave and feeling like I couldn't share anything because I knew I looked crazy. I knew that I couldn't say the right things to make sense about why I wasn't able to leave. But it really didn't hit me until afterwards when I left and I looked at what it cost me financially. I looked at what it cost me in time. I looked at my health, how I was doing physically. Then I look back and think, I feel like an idiot. You know, that's how and since then I have encountered another, she's actually a sociologist, Dr. Kristen Milstead. She's a PhD in sociology who wrote the book, Why Can't I Just Leave? And I have a kind of like I think she certainly is an acquaintance. emailed. I guess is what I'm trying to define is what do we have? We email each other periodically. She kind of gives me some updates, but I interviewed her for a webinar. So I got to hear her story personally. And of course, then she shares it in the book. That really helped me to know that here's another professional woman who is far along in her career, and it happened to her. And she also couldn't make any easier escape than I was able to. But yeah, it was really, I felt so much shame. I just felt like, you know, they warn that widows will make a lot of stupid decisions after they lose their husband. I made a lot of stupid decisions after losing my husband. I should have known better. And yeah, I certainly heard that too. I heard people would say to me, you know, I can't, how could you not known, you know, what's wrong with you? And so it was really hard. I think the biggest healing moment though for me, and it was something now that I'm so thrilled that I'm able to tell other people this message, but I got it from my sons, and where I had this really vulnerable moment with them afterwards, where we'd had dinner together and I started to share some update about the business that I had where I shared with my ex. And then I just looked at them and started crying. And I said, I feel so stupid. You must think I'm an idiot. And they both, and my oldest looked at me, and he can be quite critical and certainly very logical. And he looked at me and goes, no, not at all. He used your best parts against you. I don't blame you at all for what happened. And hearing that, realizing, yeah, those were really lovely qualities. Trusting someone's a lovely quality. Working hard to stick with somebody, that's a lovely quality. Showing compassion, that's a lovely quality. Yes, those got twisted and they got used and manipulated against me. But does that make me bad for being a good person? No, it's bad that someone would twist someone's goodness against them. There's where the evil resides, not in me, but in what was done to me. So that really brought me a lot of healing.
No, I mean, I can't imagine what it must have felt like. It does sound like a very jarring realization, though. In your case, I think you bravely shared that Caesar used your sexual abuse as a child against you. So, you know, what was it like to be betrayed in the ways that we've already kind of discussed, but also in the sense of sex being used as a way to kind of assert power and dominance over you? You know, what was that realization like for you?
Yeah, I mean, and I really quickly share that the intimacy that we experienced, the sex that we experienced, was abusive. I mean, that's not lovemaking. I made love to somebody. That's not what it looks like. But I think I did a lot of dissociating, and then just kept thinking, we can heal this, we can fix this, we can get in better footing, not really realizing the sex was abusive and degrading. So yeah, it was. I think that's what happened. As I dissociated a lot, I excused a lot. I survived it. I'd survived it before in my life. You know, my sexual abuse as a toddler. Essentially, I was a toddler, 4 and 5-year-old, was rape. I was raped. So what was happening with him is not far off from what was happening then, and I had figured out how to survive these really horrific moments. But I didn't want to piece them together and say this is the same. It's only in a retrospect that I'm able to go back and say, yeah, that was really awful. You should have ran when you saw that. You should have ran. Nobody treats people like that. There was something really broken right away. But your mind does really, it's very good at surviving, and so good at surviving that sometimes it works against you. And I definitely did that for me.
Yeah, no, it must have been awful, especially because it's one of like the first like big things you shared with him. It was really early on in the book that you shared your sexual abuse with her. Mm-hmm. Really unfortunate.
Yeah, so he knew I'd been abused because I don't know how he suspected it, but I think he shared his abuse, which now everything with him, I don't know how much is real and how much is not real. I mean, it wasn't like anybody independently verified that for me. So it may have been made up, because even the story of who abused him changed. You know, at first it was this person and later it was this person. So I don't, you know, there's a part of me that the way he sort of describes it feels a little weird. Not quite, I don't know, not quite the way that survivors describe abuse. Doesn't feel like that. So I'm not for sure how true his story is, but I do find it's intriguing that he led with it right away in that first date as a way to sort of like get me to expose mine. And then it turns around that, you know, part of Caesar's sexual makeup is Caesar doesn't make love. Caesar needs to abuse people. He gets excited by degradation. And I didn't really I couldn't know that. I couldn't hear or see that in the middle of it because it was too painful. It's like one of those things you're aware of, but you just don't look at, you just, that's what denial is. I practice a lot of denial around it.
No, it sounds like to me that, it can become quite hard to separate out sort of malevolence from benevolence, because maybe you're afraid of an intimate relationship because it's been contaminated by your kind of past sufferings.
Yeah.
It's a really tough thing. So, I mean, my question to you is, how did the sexual abuse affect your adult relationships?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things I really hate, kind of revolt against, is the idea, someone's been sexually abused. It wasn't their fault that happened, but now they're broken. So we don't want a relationship with a broken person, even though it wasn't really their fault, but now we're going to have consequences from that. So I really sort of am repulsed by that, because that felt to me totally unfair. But yet I have to say that I sort of approached it, especially with, I think even what was more powerful to me, to be honest, was my evangelical upbringing. That idea of purity and chastity, and that I'm somehow supposed to wait for marriage. And yet, how do you deal with the fact that you feel like, well, I'm not technically a virgin, although I wasn't not a virgin by my own will, but I was, so what does that make me? And then to go from, you're not supposed to do it, it's really bad, to now you're supposed to, and you're supposed to enjoy it. That's a weird flip to try to make, because you're never taught that it's good until it's suddenly good. And now you're supposed to make it good. So how do you do that? But Brad and I both came into this relationship really inexperienced. We both came from sort of similar shame-based backgrounds. And so my hesitancy and my struggle with it was the same struggle he had. So we didn't feel any tension around it, because we sort of met each other in that place. And then we sort of over the long span of years got to work out how to be with each other in that space. And I felt like it was still evolving. I think that was the other thing that I was really upset about with his death, is that I saw our first 7 years of marriage was without kids. And that was good. We really did well not raising kids. Raising kids for the two of us was hard. It strained the relationship a lot. It kind of brought out our worst of each of us. But so I felt like we got to retirement, we're going to experience this renewal, this period of connection again. And part of it I was looking forward is that now I was shedding and doing this. I'd been doing some therapy, really going at the sexual abuse history of myself. I've been doing work on it at that point. So I was excited about this past time with him, that we'd get to really discover each other in a new way, in a freer way. And then he dies. So it felt like all of that was robbed from me. So I was kind of hoping this new relationship that I could go there with this new person, only to discover that, no, what I did was I married the worst. I went back to my past and married the most abusive person I could find. So it was just sort of like, sheesh. But I felt like the recovery for me from the sex abuse has been a long journey. And I feel like I'm in a really good place with it today. But unfortunately, I just don't get to, experience that in a relationship.
What would you say is the best approach for someone to heal their shame? Whether it be sexual abuse or really anything.
Yeah. Shame is one of those things that grows best in the dark and grows best in silence. So, right. And this is something they teach you right away in graduate school, at least in my graduate training, is that the way to take power away from something is to talk about it. So even for example, I say if a client came in and I can tell they're obviously suicidal, I mean, there's all the signs, they're using very hopeless language. I'm not hearing them talk much about the future. I can just sense this person really feels like life is done and they want out. By me just saying, have you ever thought about killing yourself? Suddenly, I've now destigmatized it. And we brought it out and we can talk yeah, I actually do. I think about it a lot. Wow. Okay. So I bet it's been really hard. Let's talk about that. What are you thinking? And then suddenly they'll begin to tell me their plans and why they want to do it and how come it's the way that it is. And my ability to be present, emotionally present without being upset about it or scared or intimidated by it takes so much power away from these really painful places. And the same goes for sexual abuse. Here's the other thing, and this is what really helped me. One of my big healing experiences after this relationship with Caesar is I joined a small group of women with a certified sex therapist was just for women who survived a sexual addiction, or their partners having a sexual addiction and being betrayed and traumatized. And what she did was she gave us control and didn't push control. One of the errors therapists often make is we push our clients and we strip them of their ability, their autonomy, their agency to tell their story in their own timing. And so what she does in this group therapy is that she really allows us to sort of reveal ourselves in our own time and our own space, and gives us the control back. So that's the other key part in working with someone is don't push them for the history, but also don't be afraid of it. So if they hint at it, that's probably an opening they'd like you to invite you into asking more about it and to be present. But at the same time, don't insist they say or ask details they're not ready for. They may never be ready to tell you some of these details. Some of these things are extremely hard or very, very painful things to say. Some of these things are laced with intense shame that the person themselves can hardly look at. So it's this kind of this learning how to hold space is what I call it. Really learning how to emotionally give a sense of acceptance with non-judgment.
No. I mean, yeah, I feel like it's really important not to be imposing in those sorts of situations. And there's a level of personalization that needs to be taken up as well. No, it's been so interesting actually hearing all of your takes on these really, complex issues that people go through. We have a closing tradition here at the Right Minute podcast. It's a quick fire round. We've heard all about your remarkable work, but now it's time to kind of peel back the layers and sort of allow the viewers to kind of get to know you a bit more personally. In the interest of time, we'll ask you about 4 questions, kind of 2 questions each. So I'll, kind of kick things off then with the question I want to ask. What is the best gift that you've received?
I would say it was from Brad just before he passed away, and he knew he was really ill, but he didn't know he had cancer, and he had just gotten a new car with work, and he knew I was kind of frustrated with mine, so he said, let's go to the dealership. And so I got a new used car just before we found out that he was really, really ill, and I was touched. He even took a photo by me with the car. It was so sweet.
Oh.
That sounds like it. I guess my last question would be, what makes you laugh no matter what?
I'd say hearing a baby laugh probably makes me laugh no matter what. There's something kind of infectious about that. The joy, the sheer freedom that they have being themselves is incredible.
Well, those are my questions.
Yeah, so I'll move on to my questions now. So what would you say is a thing your kids have taught you?
Wow. And I don't think they did this. This was an accidental thing, and I'm feeling really emotional thinking of this, that time is short and we need to really, really savor the present moment, and every moment with a person is a gift. Very much so.
Yeah, no, it truly is.
Yeah.
So my last question for you is, what's the last thing you read or watched that really inspired you?
Wow. I watch a lot of stuff. So I'm thinking of the most things that I watched. I don't think they're very inspiring, but they certainly have been powerful. I just finished, or Succession is winding up on HBO. So I've been watching that and oh my goodness, it's painful watching these narcissistic people. But the most inspiring thing that I've ever watched, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I think for me, anything that is told truthfully with unflinchingly, to me, is inspiring. Even if it's super painful, I just appreciate honesty and genuineness.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I think we can all agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. And that brings us to the end of what has been a really incredible episode. I mean, Kerry, you are seriously one of the most wise, honest, the most open people I've ever met. And I think your mindset is really something that, people can really take most from. I'm sure we would agree, but it's been such an honor to kind of sit down with people like you and just kind of almost selfishly ask questions that I'm always pondering about, but never really had the answers to. But yeah, no, this is just the beginning of the Right Summit podcast. We have big plans to kind of take this podcast to new heights, expanding our guest selection, really diversifying the people that we interview. But obviously, none of this really is possible without your support. So, if you really do enjoy the podcast, please do say so below in the comment section. Engage by sort of going to Spotify, maybe that kind of thing, or just simply subscribing on YouTube as well.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me. This has been fascinating. I really love these questions. It's been a joy.
Yeah, thank you. It's really enjoyable talking to you. I really learned a lot.